here from Rain Country. God is good all the time. And I thought I'd shoot this video, and it's going to go in my FAQ series that you might want to check out. I'll put that playlist in the description box down below, about how to use ratios or parts. Because a lot of times when I throw out recipe ideas, oftentimes I will speak in ratios or parts. They're basically the same thing. The ratio is the comparison of part to part, and then the parts are the individual parts that make up the whole. And sometimes this confuses people. A lot of times people want exact measurements. Well, there's two problems with that when it comes to me and my recipes is I don't always use exact measurements. In fact, it's kind of rare that I do. It really depends on what I'm making. And a lot of times I do things by sight and just using ratios, generally speaking. And because of that, that's one of the other reasons why I will give things in parts. Like I might say 2 parts this and 1 part that and 3 parts of something else. And that confuses people because they just don't even understand what that means, because they want to know, well, is that a cup? Or is that a third of a cup? What does that part stand for? Well, that's the whole reason why I throw it out that way, because it can stand for whatever you want it to stand for. So for example, I brought out a few things. A couple of things are things I just recently started, and some are some old things. Right here is a licorice extract. It's not actually licorice extract. I'm actually extracting star anise, and you might have seen this in a previous video. Now, when I decided to start this, because it's one of the first alcohol-free extracts I'm making for flavoring, not using glycerin, and I'm using honey instead. So I decided to start with the same ratio I would use of glycerin to water. And when you say that, glycerin to water, you got to say your ratio in the same order. 3 parts to 1 part, which means 3 parts glycerin to 1 part water. And so in this one, I did 3 parts honey to 1 part water. So the amount you're making is going to determine what that part stands for. If you're wanting to make a very small amount, you might use an 1/8 cup. So 3/8 cup of glycerin or honey to 1/8 cup of water. So the 3/8 and the 1/8 are the parts that make up the whole of a 1/2 cup, which sounds really kind of weird. Let's make it a little more simple by, let's say we want to make 1 whole cup of some kind of solvent for your extract. So I'm going to do 3 of these of the glycerin or the honey to 1 of these of the water. That's 3 parts to 1 glycerin or honey to water. And that will make up the whole of 1 cup of the solvent. And this is going to apply to any type of recipe you're making. Maybe you're making a cornbread recipe and not including the salt, the baking powder and all that. You're wanting your flour or meal ratios. Maybe you're mixing a wheat flour with a cornmeal. So typically a lot of people might like to go 3 parts cornmeal to 1 part whole wheat flour or white flour. So what you would do, if you want 2 full cups of your flour / meal, you would do 3 1/2 cups of the cornmeal to 1 1/2 cup of the flour if you're wanting a higher ratio of the cornmeal. So that would be 3 parts to 1 cornmeal to white flour, and that would equal 2 cups. That's commonly what I do when I'm making a cornbread. Now, sometimes I might mix it up and leave out the wheat flour like I did the other night. I did 3 parts of a coarse ground white cornmeal that we milled on our own Country Living grain mill in there, to 1 part of a masa flour, which is a corn flour that it's not really a flour. It still has a little bit of coarseness to it, but it's a lot finer than your standard cornmeal. And so I mixed those together to see how they would come out, and leaving out the white flour. So I had 3 parts to 1 part there. So I had 3 1/2 cups or 1.5 cups of the ground cornmeal, and then a 1/2 cup of the masa. And it turned out pretty good, by the way. So I'm always experimenting and trying different things, just to get ideas. So coming back to this extract. So after I tasted it, I decided, after I let it sit for a couple weeks and I tasted it, I decided it was, even for an extract, even if I was going to add it to coffee or cocoa or whatever, or just to flavor, whatever, I decided the honey was too strong of a flavor and too sweet. And knowing that honey, especially raw honey, makes a really great preservative, I feel totally safe bringing the ratio of the water up to 2 parts or a 1-to-1 ratio. So instead of 3 parts honey to 1 part water, I have 1 part honey, 1 part water. So a 50-50 ratio would be another way to word that. Now, to understand what that's going to look like. So if you ever see recipes or anything where ratios are written, sometimes they're written as a fraction. So let's still base things off the 3-to-1 ratio. So a fraction, if I was going to use the amount that's higher, the bigger amount, like in the initial case of the extract, 3 parts honey to 1 part water. So I'm going to say honey to water, and I'm going to put 3-to-1 over that way. You can also write it out 3-to-1 as a sentence, or the common way I like to use it is with the colon, 3:1. And so whenever you see that, that might be confusing. What that is a ratio. So again, that is so that you can adjust the size to suit you. So coming back now to the cornbread recipe, let's talk about the cornmeal to white flour ratio. Using 3 parts to 1 part again. Maybe you want to make a double batch of cornbread. Usually a standard batch of any kind of like cornbread biscuits is going to be 2 cups of whatever kind of flour is your total. But let's say we want to double it and we want to end up with 4 cups of flour meal. So that's really easy. I'm going to use 3 cups of the cornmeal and 1 cup of the flour to equal the whole of 4 cups in that case. And you can go even more than that. You can triple that or quadruple that, or maybe you don't even want to use your standard measuring cups like this. Maybe you want to use a coffee mug as your measuring. So that's another reason why why someone wouldn't necessarily want to say cups or tablespoons, especially if you're talking about people that, you know, from around the world. We use different types of measurements. Some people use liters and milliliters, not like we do here in the States. Well, it would be a lot easier for them to think of something that's about the size they want. Maybe it's a coffee mug or a smaller coffee mug than this. Whatever they want to use as their device for measuring, if I give them parts, then they can easily adjust that by going by the parts. They don't have to try to figure out how much is in a cup. They can just go, okay, I'm going to use this. So in this case, let's talk about that cornbread again. 3 mugs of cornmeal to 1 mug of white flour, and now I'm going to have a pretty decent sized batch of cornbread when I get done. Of course, not counting again the baking powder and the salt and the oil and the egg. We're just talking about the flour ratio. I started coming up with working with ratios on my own before I even understood how they were written out, because let me tell you something, I was bad in math in high school. I had to, you know, I was good at grasping the standards, but when I got into algebra 1 was fine. I should have failed algebra 2 though. I should have failed because by then I was losing my attention span in the class and got way behind, and the teacher should have failed me, but he gave me a D- just so I didn't have to retake it. However, doing things like creating my own recipes and creating my own crochet patterns gave me a good grasp of my multiples and ratios even before I fully understood how ratios were written out. I just thought of it in my head. I'm going to do this much, the same amount of that, double the amount of that, and so on. But learning how to create and use and read ratios as they're written out will help you to be able to easily create your own recipes. Now, another example I have here, this is something I just mixed up yesterday. I go through a lot of my herbal infused oil because my skin cream is one of my top sellers on my store. And it's something that's a little easier for me to keep up on, but I have to make sure that I have a good supply of infused oil going at all times. So I have quite a few quart jars of infused oil. So every time I empty one, I get another one going. And when it comes to my herbs, I don't use measurements. As you can see, if you look at any of these videos that I've done on these kind of things, but I usually go by sight and parts. So every herb I use in most cases is going to be 1 part to 1 part to 1 part to 1 part, which means simply equal amounts of each herb until I get the jar full. Then I top it off with my oil. That's how I make my infused oils of just about any kind. Now there might be cases where I want to use a higher ratio of one herb than another. Oh yes, and same applies to any of my, I only have 3 tinctures or extracts that I use medicinally on a regular basis. Everything else is either going to be the fresh herb, making a tea out of it or something like that. But here's just a couple of examples. Here's the antibiotic, and here's the one I make for helping to sleep and as a muscle relaxer. It also does help with pain as well. Now, even though I do use in these recipes equal amounts of each herb that I put in there, there are times I think, you know what, I'm going to up the amount of this herb and decrease the amount of that herb. So maybe I'll go 2 parts of this herb and then 1 part of each of the other herbs I'm going to add, because I'd rather have more of one than the rest because I like how it works. And I usually I figure these things out as I make it and do it. So any of the recipes I make up, the whole idea of me sharing them with you is so that you can change your ratios and tailor them to suit you. Oh, and I just thought of another one, the seasoned salt. So I got the original recipe for seasoned salt, homemade seasoned salt, from Amy Decision's Tightwad Gazette. And from there, I took that and changed the ratios to suit us. So I doubled the amount of garlic and onion that were used in it and increased the amount of black pepper to salt. The main ingredient obviously is salt. And off the top of my head, I can never remember exactly how much to what. I actually have my own recipe written down and did a video on it that I'll link to in the description box down below if you want to learn how to make your own seasoned salt. But again, using the parts that I put in there or the amounts, you can change your ratios of garlic, onion, and pepper and paprika to salt to suit you, or even turmeric if you're going to add turmeric in there. So that's the whole idea. Any of my recipes, especially since I rarely use exact measurements, are meant for you to tailor to suit you. You can start off with the base idea and then add or subtract amounts that's going to suit your needs, your family needs, and all your taste buds. So it's actually pretty simple, just understanding that. I think if you at least understand that whenever somebody says the word parts, that part, you don't have to know exactly what that part is, just so long as you know what the ratio is. If it's 3 parts to 1 part and you know that the bigger amount is going to be X material here and a smaller amount is this specific material there, that's all you need to know. And then you can use whatever measuring device you choose to use. And I do the same thing when I'm making breads. When I first started coming up with my specifically quick bread recipes like banana bread, apple bread, pumpkin bread, I would find a basic recipe and then take that and tailor it to suit me. So if I know that I need a total of 2 cups of some kind of flour or meal to go in that bread, then I'm going to adjust the amounts to suit me. So maybe I don't want 2 cups of white flour. I want to make it a little bit healthier. So maybe I'll take out a 1/2 cup of the white flour and substitute it with a 1/2 cup of home milled whole grain flour. And then maybe I decide I want to add my own nut flour, my own homemade nut flour in there too. I do the same thing again. Maybe I'll take out another part of the white flour and substitute that with nut flour. So maybe what I have now is 2 parts white flour to 1 part nut flour to 1 part whole wheat flour. And that's the kind of thing I would do quite often and experiment with it and see how it turns out. So anyway, I wanted to put this out there to help people understand not only how I do things and why I do things the way I do, but also to help you understand how to read and use parts and ratios in order to create your own recipes, whatever it may be. All right, well, I hope you found this video helpful. Thanks for watching. Take care and God bless.